Everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. Please do take your seats for the best session of this past few days in Stockholm. So congratulations for your wisdom in being here. You've made the right choice, I hope. So my name is Adam Matthews. I am the Chief Responsible Investment Officer for the Church of England Pensions Board. And you're probably wondering why on earth I'm here. We are a pension fund and we have £4 billion in assets and we invest in the mining sector. And we have a long-term interest in ensuring that this sector does not cause damage to the environment and to communities in which it operates. And it's an extremely important sector. And unfortunately, I fear we're all well aware of when things go wrong, the impact it can have. And so, working with other pension funds and investors, we have been very clear that we need to be at the table with many other stakeholders and that there's an opportunity to drive genuine change in this sector. And we are determined, excited, and focused on what that change is. And I'm absolutely delighted with the speakers we have that are joining us today and those that are going to be offering contributions. We have a difficult task in the sense we've got an hour and 14 minutes. And within that, I've been told that Frida is going to come waving at me and get ever more insistent if we are running over. So those people that I call to speak, please keep within your time. And speakers as well, otherwise I'm in trouble with Frida and I'm not wanting that. So really, the reason we're here is that mining is absolutely critical to many parts of society, the global economy. We're not only invested in the mining sector, we invest in all other sectors, and mining has an intrinsic relationship with them in terms of the minerals and the metals that are provided to them. The low carbon transition is dependent on mining. I spend a lot of my time engaging with car companies. Many car companies are making commitments for electric vehicles. I would be surprised that many have secured their supply chains for the minerals that are needed for their batteries. And as investors, we are deeply concerned. And there are many issues in this sector that challenge it. We do recognise there's very good practice. We've seen that amongst many individual companies. You see some very good best practice examples. The challenge is that there are many issues where that best practice is undermined when something goes wrong in another part of the industry that isn't working to that best practice. And so how do you respond? And I recognise there are many stakeholders around this table today that have an interest in ensuring that we address these challenges and that we really get to a sector that really is working responsibly and in a sustainable way. So that's the focus of today's panel. I'm very keen it's practical, really keen to draw out lessons, examples. And I think the opportunity is a partnership that really has different actors working together with industry, with communities, with the investor finance sector, with governments, and many others to ensure that we can drive really the kind of sector we want to see. We're committed from our part. There are many trillions of assets from the investor community that are committed to working with you. And we're very keen to ensure that we do all we can to play a constructive role. So that's the agenda today. We are learning from the experience of the Global Tailings standards. And that standard has arisen as a result of a horrific disaster in Brumadinho that happened 3 years ago, where 270 people lost their lives when a hillside collapsed. And I'm sure all of us are very familiar with that disaster, but if ever there was an event that I think has made people stand up and recognise that we can't carry on in the way that we are, I think this is one of them. It should never have happened. It has refocused the attention of the investor community to recognise that what we were doing and how we were interacting wasn't working. And it has also led to a process that has created a global standard where one did not exist previously. And we're now at the point where we are creating, together with UNEP, together with PRI, the Principles of Responsible Investment, and an independent advisory panel, a Global Tailings Institute. And this will come into existence, we aim, by Q1 next year. And this institute will play an important role of independently verifying that this standard is being applied at the site level. And that's hugely important for the many stakeholders that need confidence that these tailing facilities, these dams, are being run to this new global standard. And I think the opportunity here is, if we get this right, we can do this on other issues. But it is a partnership, and it's not been easy, and the path ahead, I have no doubt, is not easy. But it does offer us a route forward to ensure that we can drive standards globally, that we can ensure that where a mine is operating, wherever it is in the world, it is operating to that standard, and that there's independence, transparency, and good governance of these issues. So that is something that we are still in the process of developing. We have determination that this institute comes to life, as I say, by Q1 next year. We're now moving from having done the work, the groundwork on creating this institute, to bringing it into an incubator phase. And there will be further information about that in the coming months. But we're very excited about the possibility here of demonstrating a new way to drive change in the sector. So I'm going to stop before I start breaking my own rule about keeping to time, which is 5 minutes, and I've done 5 minutes and 25 seconds, so I'm terrible. And the rest of the panel will show how to listen to the chair because he failed to do so himself. So I'm now going to pass to Ms. Katrin Schneeberger, who is the State Secretary for the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment, who I'm absolutely delighted has joined us today to open the proceedings. So, thank you.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, it is my great pleasure to provide opening remarks for today's side event on a responsible and sustainable mineral sector. As you know, minerals are essential to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Today, the topic of sustainable management of minerals is at the top of the global environmental policy agenda. With the adoption of the resolution on environmental aspects of mineral resources at UNEP 5.2, member states issued a strong call to align mining practices with the 2030 agenda and relevant environmental goals. The resolution requests UNEP to set up an intergovernmental process to develop proposals to strengthen the environmental sustainability of minerals. These proposals will be presented at UNEP 6 to identify possible ways forward. Switzerland is strongly engaged in this process. Without a more sustainable management of minerals, it will not be possible to achieve internationally agreed environmental goals. And we face considerable challenges: an exponential demand, uncertainty around the availability of key minerals, detrimental environmental impacts associated with extraction and use, recycling rates that are far too low, and increasing risks associated with tailings facilities, just to name a few. The question is whether we have the adequate tools to address current and future challenges. There is strong evidence of a shared responsibility. There are plenty of promising initiatives, good practices in many countries, innovative projects using tailings waste as substitute for sand, investors-led initiatives such as Mining 2030, launched by the Church of England Pensions Board to leverage change across the mining sector. We need to take advantage of the forthcoming process that UNEP will facilitate to scale up good practices, develop solutions where these are missing, and act. I look forward to hearing the discussion and what we need to have a responsible and sustainable mineral sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, State Secretary. You get my gold star already for being well within time. I'm most impressed, and thank you for what you also said. And I'm noting the intergovernmental process in UNEP 6. the need for tools, the need for practicality, and the need to scale good practice. And I also note the commitment from your government in supporting this work, along with UNEP and the other governments that are very committed to ensuring that we can advance this agenda. So thank you very much for joining us. We've now got speakers from 4 speakers, and two of them are joining us online. I believe one's having a few challenges joining us online. I recognise there's also an audience online, so I'm miraculously going to be receiving questions through some medium that I'm yet to work out that we'll pose to people later on. But just going to check, have we our first speaker is here online yet? If not, we'll move to the next. Offensi Ditsele from Botswana? Not yet. No, I think what we're going to do is, whilst we work out whether that's going to be a reality, and I hope it is, because I'm very keen we can hear, that we're going to turn to our first responder and speaker. It's Victoria Tuli-Corpus. And absolutely delighted that you could join us, Victoria, who is the Executive Director and founder of the Tebeta Foundation, former UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. And the question really that I was going to pose to you, and please respond as you see fit. Aha. We're going to go back then, in which case you can see this is moving smoothly. Yeah, are we good? Yeah, well, I'm getting a thumbs up. So absolutely delighted now that we have Offensi Ditsele. Can you hear us? I'm seeing a microphone.
I can hear you clearly.
Wonderful.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you so much for joining us. We have the Deputy Director, Department of Mines, Ministry of Minerals, Energy and Water Resources from Botswana. Thank you so much for joining us. And we really keen to hear from you in terms of the examples of the successful policy and regulations in Botswana that's helped to shift to a more responsible mining sector, and really what it is from the governmental perspective you've seen that has worked, and what you would sort of wish to share with us in that regard. So if I can pass the microphone to you.
Thank you, Adam. I think I'll just share with you one example, but I think just to open my presentation, I would say basically minerals have been very important to the economy of Botswana. We started off at independence as a poor, small country, but now we are rated as a middle-income country, and this was mainly based on proceeds from the minerals of Botswana. As I'm talking to you, I would say minerals contribute in excess of like 25% of our GDP. Basically, previously, I would say in our initial stages of growth, government was emphasizing more, because we are still a poor developing country, government was emphasizing more on attracting investors to come and develop the country's mineral resources so that they can benefit the country and the citizens. So at that point, there wasn't so much emphasis on issues of environment. I would say action in terms of around environment started in earnest around 1999. That's when government started putting more emphasis on environment protection. And that came about as a result of the fact that prior to independence, we had mining of gold and manganese around the country. And during those times, the historic mines left old mine workings and abandoned dangerous shafts, which posed safety risks to humans, animals, both domestic and wild. And these old mine workings or abandoned mine workings were also an eyesore in the environment. So in light of these problems, government recognizing this, around 99, government started amending this legislation to make provisions with more emphasis on protection of the environment, as well as remediation of the environment post-mining. Particular provisions that were made was for operators to set aside funds for rehabilitation and closure of the mines. And this shift in policy, whilst it met with resistance initially, I would say it led to positive developments in Botswana's mining industry. Mine operators are being mindful of the introduced legislation that was calling for operators to set aside funds for closure and rehabilitation. We started seeing them taking that seriously. And as we're talking, most of our, I would say almost all our major mines, they've started setting up these rehabilitation funds. And what's more pleasing, beside the fact that we're starting to see these funds starting up, what's more pleasing is that mine operators even started changing their approaches to mining. Rather than waiting till the end of mine life, some started doing concurrent rehabilitation alongside mining. So some would start rehabilitating dumps, revegetating them. And by this, they minimize the footprint that will have to be dealt with or to be addressed at the end of the mine life. I would say Adam spoke earlier in his opening remarks about the unfortunate incidents of tailings dam failure. Now we're seeing mine operators taking this seriously. They're using the learnings from this incident to make sure that we don't have these unfortunate incidents, which is not just affect the environment, it's about safety also of the public. So these are some of the positive developments that we see. Further, governments we've also seen operators in their activities. They take cognizance of this, and as much as possible, they try to minimize the footprint of the impact of the mining, be it impact on water or air pollution. We're seeing use of technologies for safe operation of the mines. And further, for government to encourage operators to shift in this direction, government also looked at the Income Tax Act, and this was amended to encourage mine operators to set aside these funds by exempting the funds from taxation until after rehabilitation and closure of the mines. This actually has been a positive development, and from the trend, we believe in the not too distant future, all our major mines would have set aside sufficient funds to cover the footprint of their operations should they come to close. And further, government is continuing to refine the laws to make sure there are further improvements in this area of environment. Currently, our ministry is reviewing the legislation to now specify the mechanisms for setting aside these funds for closure and rehabilitation, such that they are ring-fenced from operations to avert mine operators accessing the funds and using them for anything else other than rehabilitation and closure. I think I will hold it there. Adam, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for what you said. I mean, it's encouraging to hear that the lessons are being learned in relation to tailings, but equally the importance of setting aside funds for the rehabilitation and mine closure. I think this is something that, from our perspective as investors, as we look at many of the companies that we're invested in, ensuring that there really is that allocation. And I think there's a really important role between the regulation from governments and the responsibility with companies to really get that right. And I think this is an area that, as we look at what the future of mining is in 2030, that there's some real attention going to be needed. So it's tremendous to hear that experience. So thank you very much. I'm going to now turn to our next contributor, who Victoria Tuli-Korpus, I briefly introduced before, and thank you for your flexibility here. I'm absolutely delighted you could be with us, and I suspect many people are aware of the work that you have done, and I'm really keen to hear of the partnerships in the sector that can really contribute to a more responsible mining practices. As well as that, some of the examples of what success has looked like, but equally some of the challenges. I mean, if you could share that with us, and equally as we look towards 2030, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, to be very honest, I really haven't seen a lot of good practices in relation to mining and indigenous peoples. Having been the special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, this is one of the issues that keep on coming to my attention. But I was also, I also live in the Cordillera region in the Philippines, where mining has started in the Philippines at the start of the century, no? And actually for some time, 75% of the gold and silver exports from the Philippines come from my region. So we lived through this experience, and of course some of our people got wealthy, but the majority are the ones who are suffering from the impacts, the adverse impacts of mining. And in fact, the community where my uncle lived, and he was one of the leading a foreman of the mining company, it's basically has become a ghost town, because after the mining company has left, they did not rehabilitate the area, and so that's what it is right now. So I would like to speak about what I think are good practices, theoretically, that mining companies, the mineral and metal sector, should really be have in their consideration when they are doing mining in indigenous territories. And one of the examples that I can cite, at least in terms of legislation, the Philippines has a Mining Act in 1995. They revised the previous Mining Act. And we also have the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in 1997. So the Mining Act, to a certain extent, has recognized the ancestral domain of indigenous peoples. No, and they have also recognized that there should be a royalty paid to indigenous peoples whenever the mining operations are happening. No, so that's in the law. I haven't really looked very closely whether that's happening, because there are many mines outside of my region, and I haven't really looked at whether that is happening in reality. So, but in the law, that we fought for that, because we thought that why should indigenous peoples continue to sacrifice their lands to be destroyed and all that? And we never gained anything except, of course, the employment of some people. And most of those who are employed are not even from our people. There was a policy by the mining company saying you don't hire these indigenous peoples, these Igorots, because they are going to fight back. We hire the people from the lowlands, and that's something that we had to live with. And now, of course, because of the problems that the people face, even those lowlanders who migrated to our territories, at some point they managed to organize themselves and stop the open pit mining operations. No? So I think the principles that we would like to see for a sustainable minerals and metal sector is, number one, the free, prior, informed consent of indigenous people should really be obtained whenever they want to put up a mine in the communities, and the investors should really ensure that that kind of consent has been obtained. Secondly, of course, part of free, prior, informed consent is the consultation with indigenous people, so that they can, together they can define what are the bounds and limits of mining. Thirdly, we also engage in small-scale mining. And in fact, one of the communities where I worked with for several years, they have a very rich deposit of gold, and they are neighboring territory as well. But Newmont, which is a mining company, went to this particular community, and they were offering the people, of course, different promises. In the end, the people didn't give their consent. No, so the mining operations didn't start, but the people started to do small-scale mining, but very with strict regulations. No, that number one, they cannot do tunneling under the rice fields, and they delineated the areas which can be mined. So I can say that that's a kind of a good practice, because the indigenous peoples took it upon themselves to define how to ensure that sustainable mining still happens, although on a small scale. But it really, a lot of people got rich because the gold deposits are really very easily obtainable. So those are just a few examples of what I can say. This is in terms of legislation. In terms of the capacity to organize indigenous people, so they themselves will be active partners, not just passive, recipients of royalty or what have you. And of course, thirdly, joint planning and designing between the communities which are whose ancestral domains are being mined. So I'm just speaking from the point of view of indigenous peoples in my country and also in other countries where I've been, and hopefully, that's precisely why I also agreed to come to this. I mean, I've been known to be an anti-mining activist, but I agreed that I would come to this because I would like to really engage in a constructive dialogue with the sector, as well as, of course, with states. As a rapporteur, I believe that problems can only be solved if there is active constructive dialogues between all the parties involved. And that is what I'm trying to see here. I mean, to listen to you, to all those who are involved in this sector, and for me to also relay the views and the sentiments that I have heard from my own, from other indigenous peoples, not just from my country, but also from other countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really appreciated, and really appreciated in the way that you're keen to sort of work collaboratively, because I think one of the challenges we've been facing, I mean, we as investors looking at the mining company, we look at lots of detailed reports, we look at lots of assurances around good practice in terms of relationships with local communities, indigenous communities, First Nation communities, and then we see a disaster like Yunkin Gorge in Australia, where you have a 46,000-year-old heritage site destroyed, and you look at why that happened, and you realize what you've been looking at and assured about doesn't correspond with the reality of practice on the ground and at the site level. And for us, it's a challenge, because we're sort of engaging with that corporate level and wanting assurances that practice is operating all around, but then you're seeing this, and it leads you to question, well, what on earth is it we've been looking at? And so, whilst with Brimadina, you've had an example, again, of an incident that has caused us to sort of really reflect how we're interacting with communities, with mining companies, and the role that we're playing. I think Yunkin Gorge is another one where, again, we've been looking across the sector and looking at, well, what are the lessons, what are the learnings, and how do we ensure that we're really ensuring that that good practice that has been codified is operating at individual sites. And so I think there's a challenge to many actors in this space, but in particular to investors as well. So thank you for your remarks on this. So I'm now going to turn to Aidan Davey, who is the Chief Operating Officer for ICMM, the International Council on Mining and Metals. And Aidan, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's a bank holiday in the UK, and you are beaming in from that on your holiday, so thank you. Also, ICMM have been a key partner working with UNEP, working with the investor group Principles Responsible Investment in developing the global standard on tailings. And Aidan, I'm really delighted you could join us. And my question to you really is, where do you see ICMM and your members have made a sort of significant contribution to ensure that mining and metals contribute to sustainable development? And equally, where have you seen that that's not been possible and some of those challenges? So Aidan.
Adam, thanks very much, and thanks to UNEP and yourself for allowing me to be a part of what's a really important conversation. And I guess this month, marks the 20th anniversary of ICMM, so that's the time horizon that I have in mind when I think about kind of contribution of the organization. And I can honestly say that I think we've made significant contributions in several areas, although there is still, unfinished business in areas where, we would hope to see more progress, and I'll touch on those as well. But just in terms of, some of those areas where I think we have really made progress, the first is in really really establishing normative expectations for responsible mining that have gained widespread acceptance within the industry. And this started with ICMM's 10 Principles for Sustainable Development way back in 2003, but they're very high level and they're aspirational, but they do cover environmental, social, governance, and health and safety issues. But then over time, we elaborated on those through additional commitments that members were required to implement through position statements in key performance areas. And that included things like biodiversity, transparency of mineral revenues, indigenous peoples, as Vicky just mentioned, the importance of free, prior, and informed consent. That's been a member commitment since 2013. And then in other areas like water stewardship and climate change. And then later, these position statements were supplemented with the release of ICMM's mining principles. And that set out a truly comprehensive set of performance expectations across the multiple performance areas that society really cares deeply about. So just to zero in on a few of these performance areas to highlight, change in a couple of specific areas. So back in 2003, we adopted a position statement on mining and protected areas, and that committed members to neither explore nor mine in World Heritage areas, and to ensure that any current operations or future operations would be compatible with the outstanding universal value for which these properties were listed. Then about 10 years later, we expanded that commitment to respect legally designated protected areas and ensure again that any operations or changes to existing operations would have to be compatible with the value for which those protected areas were designated. And then in 2020, the mining principles raised the bar further to require members to assess and address risks and impacts to biodiversity and ecosystem services by applying the mitigation hierarchy with the ambition of achieving no net loss. So you see over that kind of 20-year horizon, a ratcheting up, as it were, of the commitments in that important area of biodiversity, or nature as it's increasingly referred to. Then human rights is another really important area of progress. So if we think back to 2002, for some, I think the relevance of human rights to business was still, highly contested. Then in 2003, we had the deeply divisive UN norms on business and human rights being published. And again, the main focus, for those of you who can recall, of the division, I think, was that deliberate blurring of the boundaries within the norms between the respective roles of states and companies. But then as ICMM, between 2007 and 2011, we engaged really deeply with John Ruggie, who was Special Representative to the UN Secretary General, to develop his Protect, Respect and Remedy framework in 2008, and later the guiding principles on business and human rights in 2011. Now, we issued detailed guidance on the corporate responsibility to respect human rights and on the establishment of rights-compatible grievance mechanisms over a decade ago. And our mining principles require members to implement the UN guiding principles on business and human rights by developing policy commitment to respect human rights, by undertaking human rights due diligence, and providing effective avenues of redress for any harms that occur. Then another kind of area of, I think, important progress is around water management and reporting. So again, a decade ago, we developed a water stewardship framework that really explicitly recognized water as a shared and a finite resource with high social, cultural, environmental, and economic values, as a basic human right, and as a fundamental ecosystem requirement. And then we follow that up with guidance on a catchment-based approach to water resources management, and in 2017 issued a position statement on water stewardship, which committed members to specific areas of progress around strong and transparent water governance, around the management of water at operations in a really effective way, and around collaborating to achieve responsible and sustainable water use with other partners. And then we subsequently developed detailed water reporting guidance to support the sector in compiling a baseline of really simple and relevant information on water, including metrics that provide a solid foundation for consistent water transparency. And then I think lastly, we've made really significant progress in the areas of transparency and disclosure. So in 2002, some mining companies produced sustainability reports, but these read more like promotional brochures, quite honestly, and were heavy on narrative, really light on data. And through a partnership with the Global Reporting Initiative, we developed the GRI Mining and Metals Sector Supplement with an agreed set of disclosures and indicators. And GRI remains a condition of ICMM membership, and it's supported by robust requirements for third-party assurance. But up until now, members' annual GRI reports were the main vehicle for reporting sustainability performance. But that provides just a corporate level kind of global overview of performance. Whereas under the ICMM mining principles, the disclosures that members have committed to will give stakeholders, civil society organizations, customers, investors, and anyone else that's interested, line of sight to the quality of management for a range of sustainability issues right down to the asset level. And beyond that, members have made progressive commitments around contract disclosure and reporting socioeconomic contributions on a consistent basis that goes beyond GRI. But you also asked about areas of progress have been harder. And at the global conference that launched ICMM 20 years ago, both artisanal and small-scale mining that, again, Vicky touched upon, and orphaned and abandoned mine site legacy issues were identified as important and really complex, but beyond the capacity of ICMM to resolve by playing a leading role. But both were areas where we signaled at the time we believe governments and international agencies should assume that lead role, and where we would be prepared to sort of play a partnering role. But I think absent a sustained institutional focus in both of these areas by the international agencies, regrettably, I think progress has been somewhat limited. But let me stop there, Adam, in the interest of time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Aidan. And I think, again, noticing legacy of mine sites, thank you for your candour on that and the need for us to really sort of have multi-stakeholder approaches to how do we engage with both that, but also artisanal, role of government, role of industry, role of many other stakeholders. So, Aidan, thank you. Right, I'm going to now move from the international to the national, and we're going to Maria Sunner, who is the Chief Executive of SFMIN. Did I say that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
She tried to train me earlier on, and I'm quite frankly hopeless. So, but Maria is going to sort of really, if you could just give us a perspective from Swedish mining industry. I mean, yesterday, John Houch and I, we were at Bullingdon, one of your members, yeah, looking at how the tailings standard is leading to significant implications for that company, and encouraged to see what they're doing. But it would be just helpful to hear from you really how the industry is committed in Sweden to the implementation of global mining standards and frameworks, and some examples really of how you see that.
Yes, and thank you very much for having me here in this very important discussion. I mean, it's very clear that in order to have a sustainable transition to a low-carbon society, we also need sustainably produced minerals and metals to base it on. And the Swedish mining sector, to put it in a context, we are quite small on a global scale, even though we actually are the largest mining country in Europe. Europe as a whole uses around 30% of all the metals and minerals in the world, but produces only 3% of it on their own. So European mining industry is not as large as it is in many other parts of the world. And Sweden, we produce around more than 90% of all the iron ore produced in the European Union, and substantial shares of other base metals like copper, zinc, lead, etc., that are vital for the society and also for the green transition. And we also have a substantial potential for more production in the Nordic countries as a whole. The bedrock up here is very interesting when it comes to many of the critical raw materials needed for the green transition. So that is a little bit to put the Swedish and Nordic mining in a context. And when it comes to being a sustainable producer, I would say that the Swedish mining sector is very committed to this. In order to become a member of SFMIN, you have to sign on our ethical code. You have to follow our dam safety regulations, which is a Swedish version where we have included all the rules and regulations that accords to the Swedish law and the European law. And we have also taken into account a lot of the international legislation that is in there. And there was a specific question also around this global industry, the GISTM, whether that was included. And that is partly included so far, but we are envisioning another review of this in the coming years in order to see that that is included in this. So there is a lot of things for the companies. And in Sweden, we have generally, you could say, like 3 large companies. Boliden, as you mentioned, is one of those. But we also have LKAB and Lundin Mining that are quite large companies. And I think some of the challenges when it comes to following these international regulations and join like the ICMM and other of these kind of organizations is that they are very well fitted for the really large companies, but it's more difficult for more smaller companies. So in Sweden, it's only Boliden that is part of the ICMM, and the global industries, what do you call it? GISTM. Sorry for the abbreviation.
The Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management.
Yes, that it is.
I took a year and a half to get there, so don't worry.
That is Boliden and Lundin that are following up to date, and I know that also LKAB is evaluating this. But when it comes to this, we also see that we have a very thorough sustainability regulation, both in Sweden, but also coming from the European Union. In order to open a mine in Sweden, there is a very long legislative process where you go through several steps in order to achieve your permit. There is a consultation phase, and there is also a lot of detailed investigation that you have to make on how you affect the environment. And in the end, you get rulings by the environmental court on very much on a detailed level on your allowed emissions and your allowed environmental performance. And there is also there is also a ruling on offsets for rehabilitation after you actually close your mines. That is something that was implemented in Sweden around the year 2000. And before that, we actually have bad examples in Sweden as well, where mining companies have not done their homework when it comes to rehabilitation. But our aim is that this should be handled in a very good way in the future, so that we definitely can see that we leave the nature back in a good condition. And when it comes to voluntary commitments from the Swedish mining sector, we have created roadmaps on how to become climate neutral. Our members have committed to becoming climate neutral in their mining operation by 2035 and in the following process steps by 2045. So we have a clear path on how this is going to be made, and electrification and electric mining operation is a key part of this. And we have also committed to actually contribute with not only no net loss of biodiversity, but also net gain of biodiversity in the areas where we operate. And the reason we do that is we see that biodiversity is extremely important, and we know that we can actually contribute by compensating more than what we actually harm when it comes to biodiversity. So we have many of these voluntary schemes as well. And maybe I also should add, as we have talking about the indigenous people here, that we also have the reindeer herding community in Sweden, which is actually more or less half of the Swedish surface, which is reindeer herding community. And the Sami people is an indigenous people. And our goal from the sector is always to work together in respect and to be able to coexist side by side with both this reindeer herding interest and other local interests and local communities that could be of great importance. And that is extremely important for the acceptance of the mining sector in Sweden. So I'll stop there.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I'm sort of noting the need to ensure that what we're talking about in global standards aren't just global standards for the biggest operators, but for the smaller operators as well. That's something that's very much the focus of the Global Industries Tailings Standard. It needs to go beyond ICMM members, and I know ICMM are committed to that, and we're delighted. I think we've got about 80 companies now that are sort of committing to work with implementing it. But also the time it takes to open a mine or get a mine license in Sweden and many countries. And I go back to that earlier point, when people are making electric vehicle battery statements and commitments or net zero targets that are dependent on batteries, has the feasibility studies been done in terms of the mines that need to produce and expand or be developed related to the time it takes to open one? And I think that's one area that we do need a lot more urgent focus. And last point on automation, where we need a very much a just transition on automation as much as we do on climate in this sector. So thank you for that. We're going to go, in 10 minutes, we're going to go to open the floor, but I've just quickly got quick fire questions, and the speakers, these just, if you wouldn't mind being really brief in your responses to these sort of final questions. We're returning to Offensi in Botswana, and really just want you to focus on 2030. You gave us the history in Botswana. I think there's that recognition in terms of the success that there has been in Botswana, but at the same time, if you could look to what does 2030 look like in terms of that vision for a responsible and sustainable minerals sector? Excellent. Your microphone's off. Thank you very much. We can.
Thank you there, Adam, again. I think in terms of the outlook for the industry in Botswana, well, obviously we've touched on the issue of how we came into being as a country in terms of the development of our mineral resources. And basically, one would believe that maybe our forefathers had the foresight to ensure that the country's mineral resources are developed and exploited for the benefit of a nation as a whole, rather than to benefit individuals and or maybe localized community, few localized communities who've been fortunate to have resources, mineral resources in that close vicinity. So basically, I would say what we're seeing as challenges currently is that the country is heavily dependent on minerals. For the economy of the country is heavily dependent on minerals, and it's even worse that we're dependent on one commodity for the most part. We're dependent on diamonds, and we have the challenges of skills or capacity in terms of the locals, and we're saying we're producing raw minerals and we're exporting them raw like that. We're not seeing much local beneficiation of the minerals that we produce here. And we faced with these challenges of, say, for instance, like the closing window in terms of funding of coal projects, which is, well, the country is endowed with mineral resources like coal. We have lots of coal, but we are unable to exploit those because of these challenges of funding. And we also seeing limited deployment of technology here. There are few entities which are run as like world-class entities like Botswana, which use technology heavily, but unfortunately that's not widespread across the industry in Botswana. And we, being still a developing country, we tend to be more disparate to see projects coming up to assist us in alleviating high unemployment rates. And we have challenges of miners who, for the most part, are still emphasizing more on profits rather than on issues of sustainability, safety, environment, and so forth. And we faced with issues of...
Offensi, we're going to have to draw to a close on this. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. But I think if you wouldn't mind just drawing your remarks to a close on this, but it's been really helpful.
Okay. Yeah, that was to set the tone for us that now going forward with government this year came up with a minerals policy to guide the development of the country's mineral resources. And by the end of this decade, we're hoping to see a more diversified mineral portfolio. We're hoping to see the citizens more skilled to work across the mineral value chain in Botswana. We want to see more embracing of cutting-edge technology in the industry for efficiency, safety, and protection of the environment. By the end of this decade, we would like to see the industry embracing best international practices. So in essence, we want to see local beneficiation of products. We want to see ourselves as not just as a mining center for rough diamonds. We would like to see us as world-class diamonds with the necessary skills and so forth. And we would like to see meaningful citizen participation in the sector, not just as employees, but as perhaps part owners or maybe service providers in the industry.
Fantastic. Thank you. I mean, that is a vision you're setting out there that I think we're going to need to unpick, because I think that is one that I suspect that there will be much interest in how we can sort of bring that to fruition and the partnerships that are needed to deliver it. So thank you so much for joining us from Botswana and your contribution. I'm now going to turn to Victoria and really just keen to hear from you. Looking to 2030, how do we ensure we're not having this discussion again and turning to people like you and say, that, look, we're failing, how do we sort this out? And what would you suggest?
Well, just one thing. I think I'd like to suggest that the sector should really engage with a conversation with indigenous peoples in the areas where they are going to do mining. I think that's the first step. And of course, to also adhere to some of the, I mean, for you to follow the guidelines that you have developed for yourselves in terms of norms and business and human rights guiding principles on business and human rights.
Brilliant. That was clear. I think that message is received. Aidan, very briefly, looking to 2030, what gives you cause for optimism, but equally pessimism? Gosh, this is a hard question, isn't it? But really, from you, turning to 2030, what does it look like?
I should start by saying by nature I'm an optimist, so
good.
I am incurably optimistic despite anything that we may see happening in the world at the moment. So I think a few things give us cause for optimism. One, we're really seeing an emerging consensus about what good looks like across a whole range of responsible mining standards. So yes, we've got a proliferation of these standards, but they all share the objectives of improving environmental, social, and governance practices. And there's broad agreement on the issues of great concern to society. And so that's really positive. And we as ICMs see a great opportunity for, and we're committed to pursuing convergence around a single global standard for responsible mining. So that's, I think, great. I also see an alignment of interest across stakeholders in support of responsible mining. So the standards one I mentioned is one example of that. Great example is, UNEP 4 with its resolution on mineral resource governance, and then 5 on the resolution on environmental aspects of minerals and metals management from earlier this year. That points to sustained focus from the international community on these issues. And when you combine that with an investor interest through initiatives like Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and the Investors Mining 2030 vision you're deeply involved in, Adam, that all to me suggests that we know what needs to be done to support a responsible and sustainable minerals and metals sector. And there's a lot of interests that are aligned in supporting the achievement of that. Again, conversely, I think there are a number of potential headwinds, and especially if we find ourselves in a world of constrained supply. I think the supply uncertainties that we all understand have resulted in unilateral moves by governments to ensure the security of supply of critical raw materials. We've seen that in Canada, the US, EU, UK, Australia, etc. Now, these policy positions typically have a competitive focus rather than a collaborative focus. And so I worry that I see potential parallels there with the rush to secure vaccines in the COVID pandemic, where regrettably, low-income countries could risk being disadvantaged in that process. Then the whole issue of bringing on stream the capacity of metals needed to support the transition, that's not simple. Because again, estimates for how long it takes to bring a new mine online vary between kind of 7, 10, or 16 years, but it's not instantaneous. Yeah. And that's exacerbated by the fact that investors, I think, are acting as a brake on increasing capacity. And that's because I think, particularly the lessons learned from the decline in commodity prices between 2011 and 2016, massive declines in market capitalization of mining companies have made the warnings from the mainstream investment community around bringing on stream, additional capacity really has had a chilling effect, I think, on the willingness of the industry to move into that supply space and be willing to respond to those kind of supply shortfalls. So I think, frankly, the combination of government moves to unilaterally shore up their supply, investors' kind of disincentives almost to invest in necessary capacity, that does really create the risk of market failure in terms of our ability to supply critical minerals. And finally, there is a risk that if we see demand shortfalls and potential increases in commodity prices, that's going to reduce the barriers to entry for less responsible players, especially for some minerals. And sadly, that could be enabled by governments who may become frustrated by the long lead times to bring new mines online and who just want to benefit from taxes and royalties associated with production as a priority.
Brilliant.
So a mix of optimism, pessimism.
Aidan, thank you. And equally, that collaborative focus that's needed, that I think that strategic dialogue that does need to be happening, and it's not just countries rushing to secure that resource, I think is absolutely critical, and we're hearing loud and clear. And I'm also hearing the challenge back to investors, fair play, so we're hearing that too. Brilliant, thank you. Maria, turning to you, Swedish mining sector, is it ready for 1.5 degrees by 2030?
Yes, I would say yes. I have to admit I'm actually very positive. In the Swedish mining sector now, we see a tremendous innovation and technological development. The ambition is to really become a front runner in sustainable mining for the future and for the minerals and metals we need. And many of our, or I would say all of my members, are committed to electrifying, going more autonomous, digital, and making the mining work much more safer in the future, but also more productive, so that we will have more out of the mines we already have. So I have to admit I'm very, very positive, and in combination with actually working seriously on minimizing the impact on the environment, I think that we are on track for actually being part of the solution for 2030 and beyond.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, really appreciate the panel and all of their contributions that they've made. You've heard a breadth of expressions, equally a sort of focus on that 2030 and some of the practical steps that need to be taken. And now we're really keen to hear contributions from the audience. And I understand Patrick Stollgren, Head of Strategic Partnerships, Private Sector Innovation, New Methods at CEDA, is our first contributor. So, Patrick.
Thank you very much, and first a word of thanks for UNEP and colleagues across the board who've worked tremendously hard to put this discussion together. Thank you very much. Also had the pleasure of shaking hands with our colleague from Switzerland just now on their engagement in this very important work. Because this is a collaborative engagement, and from CEDA's side, we're very happy to be part of the conversation, to learn about the sector and to learn about the initiatives that are now being taken. And I want to start where Adrian came on with, saying that we're now starting to understand what good looks like. I think that's a very good point of departure. My interest here is actually a question to you, Adam, from the investor side. What you see as the interest and the possibility to actually get additional investors to come on board and take on this responsibility, because you are really leading by example from the Church of England and the way that you've been working on this from your pension funds, and that's very commemorable. And even though all the industrial players and the indigenous people, governments are coming on board, without the investors and the insurance companies, we will not get to where we need to go. So, Adam, what is the trick to get the likes of you and your colleagues to take this on board head on?
I'm not seeing in the rules that I was allowed to be asked questions. Do I rule this man out of order? Yeah, absolutely. No, look, I'm going to ask John Houchin, who has long worked across the investor community, to also contribute on this, but very briefly, because I'm keen to hear some other contributions. I think we, in the investor community, we've been engaging individually with companies unfortunately, it's taken Brumadinho, Yunkin Gorge, Mariana disasters to recognise that what we were doing was not engaged in the actual issues that need to be changed. You now have multi-trillion collaborations of investors recognising that we've got to be at the table, we're not passive, we have a responsibility to be ensuring that there's clarity around what global standards look good like, what best practices, and then really ensuring that there's structures in place that are independently verifying that they are being applied. I think we've got to get that clarity around the site level. Understanding whether the company has good practice and policy at the macro level, great, that's important, the board needs to own it, but is it happening at the ground, and do we have the tools in place to really track and understand that? At the moment, we don't. I think there's examples of where that is working, and I do think that investors can then reinforce those standards with colleagues in the banking and the insurance sector and really drive support for that best practice. We're also using our tools in voting against chairs of companies that aren't aligning to the Global Tailings Standard. We can apply that in other ways. Now, our pension fund doing that makes little difference, but if we can do that across the wider responsible investment community, you can drive that in quite a constructive way, and there is that growing commitment. So I do think it's collaborative, but I do think it needs industry at the table, it needs all the other actors at the table so that we've got clarity around the standards, what needs to be done, that we've got the independent traction. But John, I don't know if you want to come in as well, because...
No, but I think that was excellent, Adam. I do believe there's a lot of money sitting on the fence, being prepared to being invested within the mining community to help us through this very important transition. But having said that, I do actually think a lot of that money is actually scared of the risks, reputational risks, and all the accidents and damages we've seen over the last few years. So there's both a whip and a carrot from the financial community when it comes to mining, and I think it's an important role to play going forward, putting pressure on what we just discussed. And I think this discussion is really important. We need to clean up the mining sector to make it investable for the super cycle that is coming now, in order to get the transition done on a global basis. And this is a very good discussion for that concept.
Thank you, John. I'm now going to turn to Tommy Kapila, who's the Geological Survey of Finland, to offer their reflections. And I believe they're online. I'm getting that subtle signal of look at the screen. Is that right? And the magic of technology will produce one of our online observers. And I'm giving notice to Natalie Mangondo, who is one of our youth representatives that I'm delighted has joined us, who we may turn to. Here we go. Tommy, briefly.
Here I am. So
good to hear you.
Thanks. Greetings from the neighboring country, Finland, from the neighborhood. I can hear a great breathing down your neck all the way up here, so I'll be brief. Just wanted to reflect on some of the things that some previous speakers said about the importance of mine closure and managing the mine closure, and how it's important for the industry, because it's a weird, unique industry because of the, as we all know, this inherently temporary nature of the mining projects. And as we all know, and like for instance, what the Mr. Ditzele said, that it's important for the environment to get the closure right, because this post-closure legacy may oftentimes be the most significant impact of the operation. But it's also important for the region and the local communities. And this was referred to by Victoria, by cases where it didn't go well, because it changes the regional economy and employment, and like Victoria said, demography and the requirements for services. So it's a huge disruption when a mining project starts, and again, when it ends. But I'm also I have a positive view about this, because I think mining projects could be seen as opportunities to produce, sustainable positive value for the region and the local communities. But for this to happen, we need to increasingly view mining projects exactly as projects, because projects have a start and an end and a plan in between, and they have objectives, and some of the objectives, of course, is to provide this shareholder value, but increasingly it's also to leave a net positive sustainable local and regional legacy. And oftentimes this is because of the investors, because this is a form of risk management. And you need to do it by working with the local stakeholders, which is good for sustainability, of course, but you need to start early. And this is where I commend ICMM, because they have for a long time promoted this continuous progressive mine closure as the way to do it. And it produces the best outcomes both for the environment, but also for the society. And it's the longest process in the whole mining project. And of course, one of the key components of this, this producing this, this added value for the region is this high value post-mining uses of the site. Like in Finland or Sweden, for instance, does it always have to be brought back to forest, or could we figure out some, let's say, more valuable uses of the site? So for each mining project, I think what we need is a modern view of mine closure. So we need to view these projects as a project from the start. And we need to have this desire to leave behind this net positive legacy and to maximize all the opportunities along the way. And so not only minimize risks, but also maximize benefits and start early.
Brilliant.
And I think what we also need is a vision and visualizations so that people see that this is actually what can be done. Thank you. Thank you.
Point well made, and closure again. I'm liking the positive optimism, and thank you for that. I'm now going to turn to Natalie Mangondo, who's the representative of youth and children, and who's been facilitated with UNEP and works with UNEP to ensure that that voice is heard. So, Natalie, over to you.
Sure. So, we know that the global mining industry is responsible for 4 to 7% of total greenhouse gas emissions, and that mines use gigantic quantities of water, drive large-scale land use change, and pollute air, soil and water, threatening diversity. Not to mention the associated consequences of acid leaching, indigenous rights abuses, as mentioned by Victoria, and fueling traditional and local community abuses in many countries like my own, and even in Botswana. So Maria mentioned that we already know the routes to decarbonization and circularity, including renewable energy supply and storage, operational efficiency improvements, electrification, and new business models. However, I believe that the sector faces a number of challenges. It's very monopolized, with 10 global mining companies dominating the sector. And although there's strong bilateral support on decarbonization technologies and solutions, with a few companies particularly active, there's very low uptake and even active skepticism around net zero by 2050 targets in the mining industry. So my question to Maria is to ask, since we already have that pathway to decarbonization, how can we go about holding those companies and countries responsible whose mining operations are significantly lagging in emissions disclosure, inclusive and sustainable net zero ambition, and what specific best practices do you have to ensure that young people play an integral role in your vision for a responsible and sustainable mining and mineral sector?
Brilliant. Maria. Yeah.
Well, there was a lot of questions. I think what the Swedish mining sector is aiming to do is to lead by example when it comes to especially decarbonization, because we think we have come a far way when it comes to that. And we also have the advantage in Sweden of having a carbon-free electricity system. So when we electrify, we actually go carbon-free in our emissions, even if we include the emissions of the electricity sector. So that is one of the points I think it's very important for us. And when it comes to the question on how to involve young persons and youth, I think what we are trying to do is also to talk a lot to the young people on mining and why we need mining. I think we need to have a better understanding, because we need the young people to be interested in our business and in our operation, and to actually contribute and to see us as part of the solution. I have to admit, I realize we must have very different problems when it comes to how things work in Sweden and how it works in other parts of the world when it comes to how we approach young people and child labor, that kind of questions, for example, because it's not even on the discussion board in Sweden, because it's so unrealistic that we should have those kind of problems in Sweden these days, I would say, even though it has existed in history as well, even in Sweden.
Thank you very much, Ria. And I'm just giving notice, I've been told Pascal Paduzzi next. I just on your point around genuine net zero delivery from the mining community, I mean, from the investors' perspective, we've been engaging with a number of the larger operators around their targets, not just their scope 1 and 2, but their scope 3, trying to understand the complexity where you've got companies that produce some things that are clearly contributing to emissions and climate in a negative way, but also some of the solutions. So you've got a complex challenge there. I don't think at the moment we've got the right standard for the sector. I think we're working as investors to basically define what a credible net zero pathway looks like for it, that needs to be transparent, needs to be rigorous, and one that really levels the playing field on scope 1, 2 and 3, and really enables then the companies to demonstrate that they have a plan to deliver and to do that transparently. So I think a good question and point well made, and I think work that we're still needing to really do, I hope, in the coming few months on this. So thank you. Pascal, I'm coming to you. We're up against time. Frida has given me the death stare. We've got short time before conclusion. So Pascal, very good of you to join us. Please, Director Grid Geneva.
At the United Nations Environment Programme, I will be taking 2 minutes of your time. So I think there is one issue that has been overlooked in mining, and actually it's the biggest material we are extracting is sand and gravel. It's basically the elephant in the extracting room. So we are extracting 50 billion tons of sand and gravels worldwide. That's enough to build a wall of 27 meter high, 27 meter wide, all around planet Earth every year. And despite this amount of volume that we are using for all our infrastructures, the roads, the tunnels, hospitals, schools, houses, and so on, but also glass and computer chips and land reclamation, despite that, there is no monitoring, global monitoring of this material that we are taking. And there's a huge impact that is generated by the extraction of sand and gravels, because unlike many other minerals, sand and gravels are also extracted from rivers, from beaches, and from the marine environment. And in those settings, sand and gravels are playing a dynamic role with the ecosystems. Sand is filtrating water, it's protecting our aquifers against coastal salinations, it's protecting against storm surge, it's supported biodiversity and so on. So when you're extracting sand, you are actually killing some of the functions that on which we are depending for the water quality that we are drinking, or for the fishes that we are fishing and so on. And so far it's been totally under the radar screen. It's only recently in 2019 that the member states have issued the first resolutions that look at sand in Resolution 19 in UNEP 4, and recently this year at the United Nations Environmental Assembly, Resolution 12 is asking for continuing monitoring this issue. And we need to anticipate, because the build material, all the concrete that we need for infrastructures is only going to increase, especially in Africa, where population is going to double by 2050. And by not only we have an increase of population, but we have migration from rural to urban area, and we have all the catching up on development that is going to exacerbate the demand for sand and gravels. And if this is not anticipated, then this material is going to be taken from cropland, from rivers, from beaches and other places, impacting further the development and the environment. So we need to look at long-term supply. And what you see on my background is this report that we have produced this year at the United Nations Environment Programme. It's called Sand and Sustainability, 10 Strategic Recommendations to Avert a Crisis. Because the good news is that we can still avoid a crisis. But we have to be quick. And I will just give one of these recommendations because I won't have time to go through all of them, of course, but just one. It's about reducing and substituting sand by other types of material. We just spoke, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned these 300 people killed because of tailings, mine tailings, but actually we could mine iron or other ore and at the same time extract sand and gravels. So instead of making tailings, and that's what we've done, we looked at chemical and physical properties of this tailing at the exact settings where there was those people being killed in January 2019. We looked at those tailings and we could actually say that this material is good for building material. It's good even if you purify it to make glass. So instead of making tailings, mining companies, and it's a call I'm making here, could study if they could co-generate iron ore or other type of mineral ore and a building material in order to avoid to bring those tailings. And all the material that could be taken from those tailings will not be taken from the natural environment. So it's a win for the mining industry that makes additional revenue from selling this building material, and it's a win for the environment because we're not going to take further material from rivers, beaches, or other places where it's harming the environment. So I think we need to completely change the way that we are currently mining activities, and definitely not only for the biodiversity and climate, but also for reducing the amount of waste that we are doing in terms of wasting those resources into tailing, whereas they could be used for building material. And
Thank
with
you,
that, Mr. Chairman,
that is very good. And you have given us all a lesson in how to promote a report you've just produced by giving it your background. So excellent promotion. Thank you, everybody. I mean, look, I think over the session we've heard around the demand, the feasibility of the role that mining can play in the transition. We've heard about closure, the importance of indigenous rights, and the need for dialogue, automation. I think that's featured, climate change, tailings, artisanal mining, deep sea mining, ownership, biodiversity. This is an enormous agenda, and this sector doing it by itself is not going to be able to do this. So it requires collaboration, it requires partnership, it requires innovation, and it requires very different partnerships. I think in tailings we've got the beginnings of that, and I think there's a lot of good practice that we can draw upon, and a lot of the actors around the table that can actually contribute to this. So my appeal really is to go away from here and look to build those partnerships. I think work with UNEP, work with investors, expect of us as well, and I believe a 2030 vision of this sector that is fundamentally responsible and sustainable is achievable if we get the right partnerships. So I'd like to thank everyone that's spoken. I really am grateful for that. We're going to draw the session to a close. We're going to thank UNEP and we're going to thank CEDA for having set this up. There is a recording and we are grateful for your time and thank you for coming and goodbye.